The goal of the 19th is really to change the conversation around how we talk about women and LGBTQ people in politics.
We are firm believers that all issues are women's issues. Our readers are people who want to be better informed and better able to participate in democracy.
We're aiming to change the future of American journalism by giving women and the LGBTQ community the platform and the voice that they deserve.
There's never been a better moment than right now.
The 19th is the newsroom that we've been waiting for.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Live with the 19th. I'm delighted to welcome you to our first event of 2022. I'm Emily Ramshaw, co-founder and CEO of the 19th, an independent nonprofit newsroom that aims to empower you with the information, resources, and community you need to be equal participants in our democracy. Today, the 19th is bringing together State House reporters from 4 states for critical conversations on the rapidly changing landscape for reproductive rights around the country. Since the U.S. Supreme Court's conservative majority expanded, Republican-led states have advanced new restrictions that reduce access to abortion or effectively ban it outright. Meanwhile, states like California are developing legislation to protect abortion rights and establish themselves as safe havens for the procedure. What will abortion access look like in your state if Roe v. Wade is overturned or dismantled? Before we get started, I'd like to thank our streaming partner, Mississippi Today, and welcome their readers. As our conversation kicks off, we hope you'll share what resonates with you on social media using the hashtag the19thlive. And if you haven't yet subscribed to our free newsletter, you can do that now at 19thnews.org/subscribe, where you can find out about upcoming 19th News events, read our journalism, and more. Now, before we head to the states, we want to talk about how national views on abortion are changing. How do Americans really feel? It's complicated. Barbara Carvalho is the director of the Marist poll, which regularly measures public opinion at the local, state, and national level. Amanda Becker, Washington correspondent for the 19th, will moderate. Amanda?
Thank you for joining us today for this conversation with Barbara Carvalho. She's a pollster tracking how Americans feel about abortion, including the 2 recent laws passed by Mississippi and Texas that ended up before the Supreme Court. Thank you for joining us today, Barbara.
Thank you very much for having me.
One of the things that really struck me is over time, Gallup has been polling on abortion going back to right after Roe v. Wade was decided in 1973. So I'm looking at a chart you sent me. It starts in 1975. Could you tell us a little bit, just give us kind of the big picture about how Americans have felt about abortion and whether it should be legal over the past, we're going on 50 years now.
Well, I think it's very, very interesting that opinion on abortion has been very consistent over time, especially during the last few decades. Initially, when Roe v. Wade was passed, we saw much greater support. I think that was a period of time where we saw a great deal of support for abortion to be legal. There's a number of different ways that pollsters do ask this question, and questions do matter. So we may want to chat a little bit about that. But what's interesting is, despite this, this debate, which always seems incredibly contentious, I would say, just as an to kind of have an overview of this issue in public opinion. 2 things. One, most Americans want abortion to be legal. So I think we have an incredibly strong consensus for that. But the second half of that is that many Americans also want significant restrictions for certain circumstances. And that's what the Gallup question over time has tapped into as well. The one thing, and this is a question that Gallup has asked, which basically asks, should abortion be legal under any circumstance? Should it be illegal in all circumstances? Or should it be legal only under certain circumstances? And we find that opinion really is about that middle position. Only about 1 in 5 Americans over time have really wanted abortion to be illegal in all circumstances. And again, right now, the majority of Americans, and actually an overwhelming majority of Americans, want it to be legal either in some circumstances or in all circumstances.
One thing that really struck me when looking at this Gallup polling is that even though, a strong majority want abortion to remain legal in some aspect, whether there's restrictions on that or not, the one number that looks like it's moved a lot is the people who identify as pro-life. I'm looking at 1995, it said about 33% of Americans identified as pro-life, and that's now 47. Is that just, what can that be attributed to? Is that just the way questions are asked? Is it that people consider themselves pro-life while also supporting abortion in certain limited circumstances? Or, what could account for kind of that trend line that we're seeing over the past 30 years?
That is a great question, and it actually gets at the crux of understanding public opinion. There have been a number of questions that have been asked over time about the abortion issue. The one we've talked about, it's kind of three choices. And I know we don't want to make this, polling 101, but I think it is important for the buyer to be aware that, the issue or people's opinions on the issue can look differently depending upon how the question is asked. The question that has also been asked over time is whether people actually identify as pro-choice or pro-life. And you mentioned that this has changed. It's an interesting kind of analogy, but it's similar to when we ask people in polling, do you consider yourself a Democrat or a Republican? It's not how you're registered. It's not necessarily how you vote, but it's how you think about yourself at that particular point in time. And the reason why that kind of identity question has moved over time is not necessarily because people's opinions have changed, but because the debate changes. So when we see a very strong move to making abortion legal in every circumstance, as it was characterized during the Obama administration, that somehow we were going to make these policies less strict. Then we see this kind of merging. It was almost divided. And at one point, during a couple points actually during his administration, we actually saw more people identifying as pro-life than pro-choice, which was very unusual, something we hadn't seen at too many points in time. Then we come to the Trump administration and the changing of the court. And since that time, we have seen a much wider distance, just like we sometimes see the distance between Democrats and Republicans. And now we see Republican identification somewhat increasing. But in this instance, during this time period where the debate has now shifted to making laws much more strict and perhaps making abortion illegal, we see people identifying more with the pro-choice position than we do the pro-life position. And you're exactly right, Amanda. It has to do with the fact that people aren't necessarily on one side or the other. It's not that opinion on abortion is difficult to measure for pollsters, but there are a lot of nuances. And it's not that people's opinions are changing. It's the definition of what is being called pro-choice and pro-life.
Moving on to some of your more recent polling that you've done with Marist, I was looking at some results from 2019, heading into the year before the 2020 presidential election, as things were getting started that summer, in the year before that. And one thing that struck me was when people were asked kind of what was the most important issue or the most important factor in deciding their vote for president. I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, specifically in the groups that identified as pro-life and pro-choice.
Well, we've always seen somewhat of a difference in the fact that the intensity of support of the pro-life position. Over time, when we have looked at the importance of this issue to people's votes, it has always been the pro-life advocates that have had greater intensity and has seen it linked to the political outcomes of elections. At least, this is again post Roe v. Wade. What we've seen since the Trump administration is a greater concern among progressives, among Democrats, and an increase in the intensity of people's support, not just support of the issue, but seeing it count more in elections. In other words, they're less likely to vote for a candidate who is not aligned with their position on abortion, and they're more likely to say they're going to vote because that is a deciding factor in their vote. So we have seen the shift, again, somewhat due to the debate and what is at stake in each election. But this is somewhat of a newer phenomenon for progressives. The AP and NORC did a survey in December, which actually pointed to this particular fact, that Democrats in general do see there's been a tremendous rise from maybe 1 or 2% as being the top issue. And I know that that doesn't sound like a lot. It's still a lot of people, but it has moved to 12, 13% of Democrats saying that's the number one issue. And that's a really big deal because it's posing it against things such as healthcare and COVID and the economy and jobs. So we can really see that transition. But it did start during the Trump administration, and we saw it in polling around the midterm elections of 2018 and then later in 2019 when we were polling.
And to give people a better idea, this one of the polls I was looking at that I referenced in 2019, we're asking people which of the following issues will be the most important factor in deciding your vote for president in 2020. The issues that they were given were healthcare, immigration, personal financial well-being, America's role in the world, climate change, guns, as well as abortion. So that's kind of the scope of issues that they were choosing between.
Yeah.
In addition
and we also did ask that later on, including the economy, and abortion still maintained a very strong position in terms of priorities, and particularly among progressives.
I know you're tracking shifts, not just during the Trump administration, but as people have become more familiar with these laws in Mississippi and Texas that found their way to the Supreme Court. And, we're waiting to get a major decision on Roe v. Wade, probably this coming summer. What are you seeing in terms of public opinion as it relates to those laws specifically? I know generally, I was looking at a Marist poll from a few months ago, I think it was October, and they asked the question, do you support or oppose a law that allows abortions, but only up to the time cardiac activity is detected 6 to 8 weeks into pregnancy? Now, I was actually surprised that 30% of Democrats said that they supported a law that said that. So I was wondering kind of how that squares with what we're seeing from these very specific laws out of Mississippi and Texas.
If I might, I would just like to take one step back, because
Sure.
we talked about a question that's been asked over time by Gallup, which asks, legal, illegal, and kind of something in the middle. We talked about the issue of identifying as pro-choice and pro-life. When we've been doing our research on what Americans think about the issue of abortion, as I mentioned, it's not so much that it's a difficult thing to measure. We've asked a number of questions about where people, what people's position actually is. And what we find is that there is actually more of a consensus than our debate would suggest. So we give people all of the options that are debated, or most of the options that are debated in the public realm. And what we find is that there is really kind of almost a meeting of the minds around what Roe v. Wade was originally in terms of the first trimester. So when we move to the states and we look at some of these other laws, it's actually not unusual for us to see support from individuals who might seem counterintuitive. The struggle here is kind of two things. That the issue is becomes somewhat counterintuitive for people because on the one hand, if you think about it, conservatives want stricter laws. They want government regulation on this issue. But in the case of most issues for conservatives, they don't want any government interference. For progressives, it's just the opposite. They want protections, they want regulations. So I'm sorry, they want protections, but they don't want regulations. So they don't want government involvement in this issue, which again is counter to the progressive position, where in most instances, they do agree that government should get involved, particularly the federal government, in order to make things equitable across the board. So we have these kinds of ideological conflicts within this issue. But on the other hand, once we do ask people about the nuances and what specifically their opinion is, it then does make more sense that they do want to have some significant restrictions on the accessibility and availability of abortion. What isn't kind of up for grabs is that most people, and this is where the consensus is, they want abortion to remain legal, and especially with regard to exceptions. The physical and mental health of women in cases of rape and incest, and a whole host of exceptions where it is something that people agree on, regardless of which side of the debate they fall on.
You mentioned consensus, and that was one of the things that struck me when I was looking at these numbers from October. I just mentioned that 30% of Democrats said they would support a law that allows abortions, but only up to 6 to 8 weeks. 33% of Republicans felt the same, 35% of independents. When you're looking at the opposed numbers, it's Democrats, 61% would oppose that, 59% of Republicans. Those are pretty close to one another. Is this an issue that there's a lot more agreement than we typically think as we're considering this issue?
Well, like most issues that we debate publicly, it becomes incredibly contentious, and the voices we tend to hear, whether it's in Washington or from other advocates, are the voices that are farthest apart. And so what we've seen in this issue over time is that Americans themselves aren't necessarily so far apart. I mean, if we think about the debate on gun control, there are so many areas where we have agreement and we have common ground, and that's certainly the case here on abortion as well. And I think that what happens is, each side, it's a very significant issue, and we all have a lot at stake. So it's not unusual for the voices to get loud. It's not unusual for the voices to get extreme, but there's an awful lot of common ground on this issue, and certainly our legislators and our Supreme Court justices would be helpful if they were listening.
Back to Mississippi and Texas for a second. I think that there's an especially high awareness, it seems, of the Texas law among people in other states that are not living in Texas. Are you seeing either of those two laws and public awareness of those laws and public awareness of what's before the Supreme Court changing these numbers, moving the needle? And if so, which direction is it moving?
There's no question that Americans are very much in tune with what is going on in the Supreme Court, and the fact that Dobbs-Jackson Health Organization case is before the Supreme Court. That has not gone unnoticed, and the changing of the Supreme Court during the Trump administration has raised this raise this issue to the top of mind for many Americans, as we've discussed. It's a priority. Americans will see this as many Americans will see this as a priority going forward to the midterm elections. I think also, just in the case of the Supreme Court itself, I think that there is a danger there, which a number of the justices have pointed out in their discussions, of the court getting really very, very far ahead of public opinion in the Mississippi case. There is not a consensus for Mississippi. I think that there is certainly a question of threshold in terms of viability, and that has been a difficult one for the courts to maneuver around. But this brings it to a very different level, and we will certainly see in the coming months how the justices decide that. But there is no question that the Mississippi case is one that is pretty far ahead of, the courts would be getting way ahead of their skis on this one, because of the fact that there is not a consensus for those kinds of limits. And it is very also significant for Americans that there are very clear guidelines for exceptions, because again, that's where the consensus lies.
We're in an election year. We're headed into the midterms. Every member of the House of Representatives is up, as well as a third of the Senate, roughly. How closely are Americans now and registered voters tying the issue of abortion to those types of races? Is it something people are thinking about in a non-presidential year? Is that something you expect to be something we're hearing about a lot on the campaign trail across the country as people are running for office this year? And, I guess just how closely are Americans kind of tracking abortion as it relates to this being a midterm election year?
And since the court is sitting with a very important case, Americans are very much in tune with the issue. And depending upon the decision in that case, I think you will see a very real strategy on both sides to make that an issue. I think that what we have seen is, though, that issues come to the fore with leadership. And so Americans can't necessarily make that argument in the public realm if there aren't candidates that are taking up the charge. So when we have seen President Trump make that an issue for the court and speaking specifically to his constituency on that issue, that's a way that politicians and candidates can make that an important issue for voters. I think a lot is dependent upon what the progressive and the Democrats decide is the areas that they want to focus on, what they see as most beneficial to them winning. Right now, I think this is certainly very top of mind for many Americans. The Democrats did incredibly well among suburban voters in 2020. That is certainly a group of voters, particularly women, who are just a central part of their winning strategy. But Americans can't necessarily do that on their own, and candidates need to show the leadership on these issues to bring Americans and to bring voters to the polls.
Do you have any idea at this point? We are 11 months out from the election. We're probably 6 months out from a decision from the Supreme Court. Which party do you think this could benefit in November? The case being before the court and this being kind of top of mind for voters right now? Is it too early? Does it depend on what the court does? What could, is there any takeaway yet in terms of the midterm elections and abortion?
I think there's no doubt that this is an issue that can be beneficial to Democrats in their strategy. certainly one where many of their constituencies have significant concern. Certainly, there is no crystal ball in politics. Some people think that us pollsters, do have a crystal ball, or are good at the tarot cards or something. But unfortunately, seeing the future isn't really part of our skill set. We are able to measure opinion and understand where it is. It's an issue that is certainly needs to be part of the Democratic discussion, part of their game plan, and it's as the court has moved to be more conservative. 6-3 on many issues of importance to Democrats, certainly 5-4 on others. I think it is very top of mind for Democrats and independents who lean Democratic. Remember, there aren't a lot of independents anymore. We can probably count them on one hand. Although people are more likely to identify as an independent, everybody does lean one way or the other. And it's those voters that Democrats more than likely are trying to appeal to and would find a benefit on this particular issue.
We are about out of time. If there was one top line or one number or one figure or one idea that you wanted to leave with people to think more about and to track over the coming months, what would it be?
Well, I think first, as an idea, we have consensus and we need to find a way of getting there. But as a kind of observer of public opinion, which all of us like to be, focus on the question and keep us pollsters honest, make sure that we are asking questions which you can fit your opinion in, that we're not forcing you one way or the other, that when we're measuring this issue, you can tell us what you feel and where you stand on this issue, and not just this issue, all issues. Because then if you can't, we need to be doing a better job at measuring opinion.
And what would be the best way for them to do that? When you're contacted for a poll, is there a question at the end for additional feedback, or how could people deliver that feedback if they're contacted to participate in one of these polls?
Oh, sure. We're always asking people for opinion, statistically and otherwise. But when we're looking at our questions, we're keeping track of people's opinions, not only on the questions themselves, but also we're gaining feedback from them specifically to see if our questions are difficult for people to answer. Another thing, though, is that you can always contact us at the Marist poll, either through our website. There's lots of contact information there as well, in terms of telephone, the old-fashioned way, texting, and any kind of way that you can contact people. You can get a hold of us, and most reputable public pollsters. If you can't find a way of contacting a pollster, you should probably skip over their data and move on to a more reputable source.
That is a great tip. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about abortion access.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate having this discussion with you.
Thank you, Barbara and Amanda. Now we're going to hear what's happening in state legislatures around the country when it comes to abortion access and reproductive health care. Kaylee Skinner is the managing editor of Mississippi Today. Hannah Mizell is the Illinois Government and Politics editor at NPR Illinois. Emily Hoven writes the daily What Matters newsletter on California policy and politics for Cal Matters. Barbara Rodriguez, State House's reporter for the 19th, will lead this conversation. Barbara?
Hello, and again, thank you to our panel for joining me. I want to kick things off by better understanding each of you in terms of your lived experiences as reporters whose coverage includes abortion. I'm curious about what abortion legislation you're tracking in your state, and what do you think it says about the status of state level abortion policy in America right now? And we can kick things off with Kaylee.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Obviously, the big thing Mississippi is tracking is what's going to happen in the United States Supreme Court with Dobbs versus Women's Health Organization. it's Mississippi's 2018 law that would ban abortion after 15 weeks. And it's a really big deal because what's going to happen, whatever the court decides, it's kind of a testing ground. It's the first time we've had a pre-viability ban come up since Amy Coney Barrett was appointed. And so obviously oral arguments were in December, and I think we're going to probably have a decision in June. So we're just watching closely to see whether Mississippi changes what happens to Roe v. Wade.
And Hannah, what about you?
Well, Illinois has kind of done almost everything it can do in the last 5 or 6 years to shore up abortion access, abortion rights. And I, in preparation for this, I called, one of the Personal PAC, which is this big abortion rights group here in Illinois, and I called the head of, former lawmaker, Thomas More Society attorney, and I had them give me their takes. And I mean, according to Personal PAC, we're kind of all done. In the last several years, we have eliminated Illinois' trigger law for a future where Roe would get a direct challenge from the Supreme Court. We enshrined abortion access, as a constitutional right in Illinois with legislation in 2019. This past fall in October, the democratically led legislature repealed this years-old Parental Notice of Abortion Act. And I mean, it's kind of funny because both sides will kind of use this as, one will say, Illinois is the abortion capital of the Midwest. And those who want that say, yeah, we are. Please come in from Iowa, from Missouri, from, Indiana. And as we move forward into a post-Roe future, possibly, that's actually the reputation that a lot of the liberals want here.
So I definitely want to make space for talking a little bit more about some of the states that are doing kind of proactive measures. And I know, Emily, I want to ask you a little bit about California, but we'll get into maybe some more details in the future, but I still want to give you the space to tell me a little bit about yourself and what you're tracking in California.
Yeah, so thanks so much for having me. I write a daily newsletter on California politics, and definitely so far this year, we've already seen abortion kind of be one of the hot daily topics of conversation in the Capitol. Similar to Illinois, I think California is really positioning itself as a sanctuary. That was actually the word that our governor, Gavin Newsom, used to describe the state if Roe versus Wade were to be overturned or severely, restricted. And basically, lawmakers for years have been doing all they can to increase access, increase legal protections for providers and for patients, ensure that minors can access abortions, things of that nature. And I think now what we're really going to see be a big topic of discussion in the Capitol is just how do we shore up our infrastructure and our providers to potentially handle this influx of patients that could be coming in if all of these states are going to restrict abortion in some way. And so there's going to be a big funding push to, help organizations that are already connected to providers, people that are helping women access funding and travel resources, childcare. We're going to see people say, okay, we need to get more money into our infrastructure for healthcare workers and make sure that people in underserved areas in California and rural areas, in areas that have more religious affiliated health systems, are able to access that care. Because even though California, kind of sees itself at the vanguard of abortion access, there are still many women in California who, because of where they live or because of their economic situation, may have less access than would be ideal for the Democratic-led legislature.
So I've heard a couple of references to the fact that the US Supreme Court is on the cusp of making a decision over a 15-week abortion ban out of Mississippi. Specifically, Kaylee made a reference to it, but the fact that this is expected to either overturn Roe v. Wade or perhaps weaken it in some fashion. There's already been some observers who have noted that 2021 was a record year in terms of abortion restrictions, and that perhaps 2022 is going to be some extension of that. I'm curious if anyone has any insight in how that really feels on the ground in your respective state houses, how policymakers are really talking about this, or whether there's a sense of urgency or something that feels different compared to 2021? And we can kick things off with Hannah.
Sure. Like I said, there was definitely that feeling of, in the fall, Democrats really wanted to get the Parental Notice of Abortion Act repealed and, have that final anti-abortion law off of Illinois' books, especially in light of, the oral arguments again in the Mississippi case. And then also, in reaction to the Texas 6-week ban in September when it went into effect. There was one piece of legislation that was kind of interesting. It was definitely a press pop kind of bill. It was to kind of weaponize the Texas model in terms of, instead of deputizing, how Texas did, deputizing citizens to tell on, perhaps their neighbors and collect a $10,000 reward for, folks who had an abortion. It was deputizing, women who had been abused or raped or, otherwise sexually assaulted to collect a $10,000, civil penalty for their abuser. That's a bill that's not really going anywhere, but it was very interesting. I had that story, and then it got picked up on, there's a lot of TikToks about it, and I'm not on TikTok, but and we've seen copycat kind of bills other places. But yeah, I mean, there was definitely a sense of urgency in the fall to get that last Parental Notice of Abortion Act, that last anti-abortion law off of Illinois' books in that time where, it felt as if abortion rights were, being obviously restricted in other places. Like I said, Illinois' trigger law has been gone for several years now, but still they wanted to take a stance.
And just curious, Kaylee, on this same point here for you about just whether there's a sense of urgency there. There are a lot of eyes on Mississippi, given that it is at the sort of epicenter of this case before the Supreme Court.
As far as legislation, I'm going to knock on wood because who knows? We're in the middle of a legislative session right now. I don't know that the Capitol has any major incentive to pass any more legislation because this 15-week ban that's before the Supreme Court is not even the most restrictive ban Mississippi has passed. We've had a trigger law in the books since 2007. They, in 2019, passed a 6-week fetal heartbeat ban that immediately got struck down. So right now, the only bills we've seen have been ones that would criminalize performing abortions, but I don't think that that's going to go anywhere right now, given that we have this gigantic case before the Supreme Court.
And Emily, I'll kind of obviously ask the same question, but see if there's a little bit of space here to talk about the dynamics of what it means to be seen as potentially kind of a sanctuary state and the practicality of how anything is actually supposed to play out. Because I think a lot of folks have probably just seen the headlines that says, California is thinking about doing this thing.
Yeah, I mean, always the politicians are kind of trying to capitalize off of this moment in a lot of different ways. I mean, California has long positioned itself as a sort of vanguard of abortion access. And then also with the Trump presidency, it was really, Gavin Newsom really made us seem as the counter state to the Trump presidency. So we're going to lead the resistance. And after the Texas abortion bill was passed and upheld by the Supreme Court, Newsom, went out and said, we're going to use the exact same thing. We're going to deputize private citizens to go after assault rifle makers and anyone that makes ghost guns. And he also convened this council called the Future of Abortion Council that basically would make a contingency plan for if these laws are upheld, California would be prepared to kind of handle this influx in patients. And it's still very early in the legislative session here in California. So a lot of legislation has not been introduced to kind of put those recommendations into law. However, the governor did recently unveil his budget proposal, which is going to go through a lot of revisions in the next 6 months or so, but it did include around $20 million to kind of ramp up that infrastructure ensure that there's more healthcare workers going into reproductive services. There was also another $20 million or so for like security and infrastructure around providers and clinics. He also included language that would make it easier for women on Medi-Cal, which is the state's healthcare insurance program for low-income people in California, to get telemedicine abortion, so be able to get that medication over the phone without having to go in and see a provider. And so those are some of the steps that the state is taking right now to increase access. But I think as lawmakers start introducing bills, we're going to see a very sustained push to increase funding for all these providers, help women from out of state come into California. Again, the logistics are kind of unclear at this point, but one tangible idea that they do have is to create this sort of landing page that would have a list of all of the providers, insurance, laws, where to go, where to find, travel assistance, hotels, things like that, so that women and people coming in from out of state who are not familiar with California would know where to access services and what their rights are.
I think I also want to give space to better understanding how even asking someone from one state that has a very specific politics at play and how they're different from others, how it's all kind of intertwined because of the fact that there are state borders that folks can cross. And I'm thinking a lot about the coverage of the 19th, thinking about what the effect of even the Texas law has had on some of the surrounding states. And so I'm curious if there's any particular data point or anecdotal experiences of the folks that you've been covering that really stand out to you to better understand sort of what's at stake here, because so much of policy around abortion is very much a state level issue compared to how people think about maybe Congress. And I don't know if anyone wants to jump in where that feels like something really stands out.
Well, in Illinois borders, a lot of Midwestern states, but specifically Missouri, I would say has the most restrictions on abortion. And there's a clinic kind of on the Mississippi River on the border there. And a few years ago, New York Times, the Daily podcast, did a 2-part episode on what that's been like for that clinic. And I think that, Emily makes a good point about, if California and Illinois are going to become these kind of havens for abortion access, people traveling to get reproductive health care, the existing clinics, facilities are going to need to ramp up, and places like Planned Parenthood or others are going to have to think about how they're going to scale, where to strategically open clinics, but that's always a fight, because you have to think about how are you going to approach zoning and getting all of those kind of certifications from the local municipality, who might not be as welcoming as the state at large.
Yeah, and I know anecdotally, just talking to advocates here in California, that even in, since the Texas, specifically that ban went into effect, that clinics here in California have seen an uptick in patients from what, they normally would serve. And so there's just this anxiety of, okay, this is going to go to a lot of other states. How are we going to handle this influx? And as it stands, the healthcare infrastructure in California is already pretty decimated, and that's gotten worse with the pandemic, just because of, the amount of people that have gotten infected and things like that. So it's all just kind of combining at one time and just creating sort of a dire situation. And then on the other side, actually in California, there is still a very active anti-abortion movement. And they recently secured a victory in federal court, which could potentially have some implications. And it has to do with a law that California passed last year that actually blocks people from getting within 30 feet of a vaccine clinic to, kind of antagonize people that are trying to get vaccinated, things of that nature. And actually, it was not anti-vaccine advocates that protested the law, it was anti-abortion advocates, and they got it overturned. And even though there still are protections specific to abortion clinics, I think that was very concerning for a lot of, pro-abortion activists and advocates here in California, because again, it's just kind of highlighting how politically charged this is, and how, patients entering certain clinics may be at physical danger or verbal abuse or things of that nature.
I would say I've heard similar things, Emily. Mississippi, I think it's safe to say, is not a haven for people who are seeking an abortion. There's one clinic in the entire state, and it serves the entire state. So a lot of people go out of state, but we have heard since this Texas law went into effect that the director has said they've been inundated with calls from people in Texas who are seeing if they can get into this clinic. And I think there's a concern among advocates here that if Roe is overturned or hollowed out, that the only people then who can receive abortions are going to be people with means, who can get out of the state, who can travel. So people are very concerned.
I'm curious to ask also about the fact that I've talked to some advocates of abortion access who are making the prediction that that abortion is going to end up being a really key issue for the 2022 midterms. And I'm curious if you've gotten a sense of that. There's also a little bit of what someone referenced with just the fact that there's been a proliferation of like social media, TikToks, and ways in which people are engaging and having conversations about abortion. I just would love to take a little bit of a temperature in terms of what you're seeing on the ground in your respective states as it pertains to 2022 and abortion access. And we can kick things off with Emily.
Yeah, I mean, California as a state is like so solidly Democratic that I don't think it's going to necessarily be a dividing factor in races, except for maybe in Congress, where, some of the districts are more swing districts, especially after the redistricting process that just went on. So that could play into it. To what extent, I don't know, because I'm not sure if that's going to really be a big thing, but especially at the state level, I think it will definitely be a talking point for Democrats in the sense of, if you elect more Republicans, look at what might happen. But I do think that in California, things like housing and climate change are actually more explosive topics in a way, but we'll have to see.
And Hannah, I'm curious if that's similar then in Illinois, given the fact that it's sort of Democratic led.
It is similar, but I think, our geography is different than California, whereas like California has many big cities, or at least, several. But Illinois we have metropolitan areas for university towns, but really we just have Chicago and it's, surrounding suburban counties, which have been trending more blue in recent years. But, the big question is, will suburban voters cross over? And we have this big promising to be very expensive gubernatorial election this year, and our governor J.B. Pritzker has positioned himself to be this champion of women's rights, and it's going to be interesting to see how Republicans toe that line, because we are a blue state. Up until just a few years ago, really, there were still pro-choice Republicans and pro-life Democrats in the state legislature. But yeah, we don't really have, kind of similar to California, we have so few swing districts left, especially after this most recent redistricting cycle. I think it'll be a talking point. I think, suburban voters might not be the most comfortable, especially with the repeal of the Parental Notice Abortion Act. That's something that a lot of states have. And, I think a lot of voters would look at that and say, maybe we actually did want that on the books. I don't know. But in general, I think, Illinois is blue. This is kind of who we are. And this is the trajectory that we've been on for a while.
Kaylee, what about you? In terms of, I'm really curious, just given the politics of your state.
Sure. So in Mississippi, we're obviously a very red state, and abortion is always something that candidates talk about. But the argument Republicans always make is our goal is to make Mississippi the safest place in the nation for an unborn child. That's something Governor Tate Reeves has said. That's something his predecessor, Phil Bryant, has said. Democrats argue that has never been true if you look at data, because we have the highest rate of premature births and a lot of bad birth outcomes. There are plenty of pro-life Democrats. I think the argument that they make is, I'm pro-life, but Republicans just want to be pro-life until a child is born. We want to care for them after they're here. And so I think that abortion itself may not be a sticking point. The question mark for us in Mississippi is whether or not our state leaders are going to consider Medicaid expansion. That would extend prenatal coverage or not prenatal, postnatal coverage for people who've had children past 8 weeks, or even just expand the number of people that can receive that coverage. So I think that's something that Democrats push for and really want. But right now, our state leadership, our governor has not expressed he's not that interested, and our Lieutenant Governor Delbert Hosemann says that he is open to exploring the idea, but won't use the phrase Medicaid expansion. So we're watching closely to see what's going to happen there.
Kaylee, I feel like the point you just made about insurance coverage has made me think a little bit about some of the bills that are maybe moving through some of these state houses that maybe aren't getting as much attention, but absolutely tie back into abortion. And so I'm curious if there's anything that, for any of you, that stands out that you feel is going to be on the horizon in terms of very much a part of the conversation around abortion. And Emily, if you want to kick things off.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the governor had a budget proposal to basically make it easier to get medication abortion. That's some language that's being debated right now. I think we're also going to see a really big push to sort of have this gap coverage to help women who are uninsured or underinsured. And there has also been discussion of creating this fund that would basically allow for the state to compensate providers who help patients that are not able to pay for that procedure. I think in California, a lot of the discussion is, okay, it's legal in California. That is not going to change. The question is just how can we make it so that people can actually use that law and actually access these services if they are poor or they live in rural areas. And so there has actually been discussion as well. One of the recommendations in this Future of Abortion Council report that the governor convened was to sort of create a reproductive justice corps or something along those lines that would basically sort of be like a Peace Corps for reproductive justice and basically train providers to go into this field, especially, people from underrepresented groups like people of color and other minorities. So that would, kind of kill two birds with one stone, where it would help bolster California's healthcare workforce for reproductive services, and then also, give people opportunities in areas that they don't necessarily have right now.
And Hannah, what about you?
So in 2017, another component to the law that got rid of Illinois' trigger law was public funding for abortion for folks on Medicaid and for state employees who are on state insurance. But I think what Emily brings up is a good point. The money is not unlimited. What Kaylee said is, yeah, it's true. It's folks who have the means to travel to another state are going to be the ones who are more likely to be able to access that abortion across state lines. That press pop bill I talked about earlier that, is not going to go anywhere. It had a component, by the way, it was called the Texas Act, the Expanding Abortion Services Act, kind of a troll on the Texas law. Part of half of the money that was, going to be collected, that minimum $10,000 civil penalty would have gone into a fund to help people get abortions in Illinois. I do think that is, something that lawmakers are going to look at. Maybe not this spring. I have not heard that, but possibly. We've seen it's kind of been interesting to watch how quickly these abortion bills have gone forward in recent years in Illinois, because you have this specific group of female lawmakers who have pushed for it, but like very quietly and strategically. But then the other thing is, I was speaking with the leader of Personal PAC yesterday, and he said, we should really watch what is happening on the federal level in other states and what insurers are doing with birth control access. And I think that might, going forward, that might be another component to this whole debate around reproductive rights as a whole, because it's not just abortion.
And Kaylee, is there anything you want to add there?
I feel like I kind of gave my answer away too soon, but we really are just watching to see. Every year there are Democrats that file bills to expand or extend Medicaid coverage in some way, since it's the leading provider of it's a leading payer of pregnancy care. So we're pretty early in our legislative session, so there's really no way to know how it's going to shake out. But we're just keeping our eyes peeled to see if any of those bills get traction, particularly in the Senate, because the Senate leader is more receptive.
I also wanted to just quickly, I forgot to mention there's another bill that was introduced last session in California, but did not actually advance, which is interesting because it is a Democratic majority legislature. It's a bill that would basically eliminate cost sharing for all abortion and abortion related services. And so advocates are really hoping that with kind of this newfound sense of urgency, it will advance last year, but last year it stalled in an appropriations committee. So that's another one I want to keep an eye on. Just wanted to bring that up before we move on.
Oh, for sure. And I think we've only got just a couple of minutes left. I want to make sure that I give everyone a space to basically talk a little bit more about individually as reporters, how, if at all, there's been an evolution and how you've been covering abortion as a topic in terms of the voices of the folks that you're highlighting. And I kind of tie in with another question about whether there's anything that's kind of misunderstood about the coverage that you hope folks kind of keep in mind for the future. And we can kick things off with Kaylee.
I was looking back through stories that I've written over the years. I used to be a State House reporter before I was the managing editor, but I think a big change we've made is language. The stories I wrote when that 2018 bill got passed was this would limit abortion for women. And now I realize when we write stories, we're writing about pregnant people because not everyone who becomes pregnant identifies as female. So that's something we've been thinking a lot about. Speaking about whose voices get elevated, like I've said earlier in this talk, there's one clinic in Mississippi. And so we've had to think a lot more about like making sure we're not always just quoting the loudest voices in the room. There are a lot of groups doing this work. And we're trying to build relationships with those people, especially as national news organizations are coming in and writing their stories. And one last thing I just want to add is that I think because Mississippi is such a red state, there is maybe people think that everyone here is what's the word I'm looking for? Is not for abortion. I think, yes, there are people who are very pro-life, but I think that also works. It's Democrats and Republicans who feel that way. It's not just these Republican lawmakers who are pushing this legislation. There are very nuanced opinions about this, whether you are speaking to like a Black person, a white person, Republican, Democrat. It's a really complicated issue and it's a deeply personal issue. So we are trying the best we can to show that nuance in our stories.
Emily, anything to add there?
Yeah, I also wanted to echo the point about language. It was very striking in the Future of Abortion Council report, kind of having recommendations for healthcare providers and just people, reporting on the issue to be very intentional in, how you're describing certain things, even certain body parts, to be inclusive of just, everybody and that would be accessing these services. And I think as well, as I said, in California, I think there's really this it has always been emphasized to reach out to people in, rural areas and people in poverty and people of color. But I think there's really this newfound emphasis on that, because I think if California wants to live up to its sort of the way it projects itself as kind of this liberal haven where, anyone can access the service, there are actually a lot of things that still needs to be improved within the state for that to happen. And so I think even paradoxically, even as California is kind of projecting itself outward, it's also really looking inward and making sure that if it's going to fulfill its promise for people from out of state, it needs to really do that within the state first. So I think that's something that I want to really convey.
And Hannah, what about you?
So I've been covering Illinois government politics for about 8 years now. And what's been really striking to me is the acceleration of, even the politicians, pushing this and using much more explicit language than they used to. I feel like it used to be, you wouldn't say the word abortion out loud, you would use other euphemisms. Another thing that changed in Illinois is about a year ago, our, historically long serving House Speaker, who was definitely a more conservative Democrat, he ultimately had to step down under this cloud of corruption, a whole other story. But, he was the one who he made the trains run on time, and, bills didn't go forward without his sign off. And in 2019, a group of women, confronted him about the stalled bill on reproductive rights that would, again, enshrine the right to an abortion within Illinois' Constitution. And they were able to convince him to let that go forward. And then without him, leading the Illinois House anymore, we've seen a lot more progressive bills on abortion, but otherwise, like a kind of nation-leading sex ed bill that I think a lot of suburban voters again might find uncomfortable. But I think we're testing the limits on progressivism when it comes to reproductive health in Illinois, and it'll be really interesting to see how that evolves within the next few years.
I believe that's all the time we have for today. Kaylee, Emily, Hannah, thank you all so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Yes.
Thank you all for that terrific conversation and deep look at abortion legislation in Illinois, California, and Mississippi. Now we're going to zoom in on Florida to see how its state laws compare to what's happening at the national level. Ana Ceballos is the state government reporter at the Miami Herald. Mary Ziegler is the Stearns Weaver Miller Professor at Florida State University College of Law. Shefali Luthra, healthcare reporter at the 19th, will lead this conversation. Shefali?
Thanks so much for that introduction, Emily. I am so excited to have this conversation with the two of you, and I was hoping, both Ana and Mary, if we could start kind of thinking in a big picture form, how would the two of you characterize what historically abortion politics in Florida have looked like, and how has it differed from other neighboring states and other states that have sort of fallen in this often swing, occasionally slight red tilt category?
I can start. So Florida historically has had a state Supreme Court that's been very protective of abortion rights. And one of the kind of wild cards in Florida politics now is whether Florida's kind of bluish tint when it comes to abortion rights, which has been historically true, is attributable to that state Supreme Court, which was once more progressive than it currently is, or whether it's attributable to the fact that voters in Florida seem to be, relative to other southern states, more pro-choice, right? So just to use one example, Florida's state constitution has been interpreted to protect abortion rights much broader than the ones in the federal constitution. And Republicans in Florida tried to put a measure on the ballot to change the state constitution and reverse that outcome. And it failed by about, a 55 to 45% of the vote kind of margin. So it's unclear whether Florida is actually less red anymore when it comes to abortion. I think it probably still is. It's probably true that the state Supreme Court, which has been transformed by Governor DeSantis, is no longer going to be protecting any kind of abortion right from a state constitutional standpoint, which leaves a lot of uncertainty when it comes to whether Florida abortion politics are going to change going forward. Because of course we have a Republican governor, Republican legislature, but a Republican legislature and governor that are well aware of the fact that voters in Florida have historically been less conservative on abortion than voters in neighboring states.
Yeah, that's really well put. I mean, in terms of the Florida Supreme Court, that since in 1989, when there was that ruling, there is a different makeup of the court. And so it is viewed, at least for Florida lawmakers, as maybe an opening if there were to be abortion restrictions passed this year, that there could potentially be a different type of decision because of the makeup of the court. Obviously, we still don't really know how that's going to be playing out, but we are seeing Florida lawmakers, particularly Republicans, following the suit of Mississippi and trying to propose a 15-week ban on abortions. And that is currently the state of politics here when it comes to abortion in Florida.
And Ana, I know you cover the State House quite thoroughly, and I would love to hear more about that 15-week ban, right? I mean, what are the prospects of it becoming law when historically gestational limits in Florida, right, they haven't really gotten a ton of traction?
Right. So one thing to keep in mind is right now, Governor Ron DeSantis usually taps into a lot of national topics, and he hasn't necessarily gone out of his way when holding press conferences to talk about abortion, but he's very much a pro-life governor, and he very much has said that he does support abortion restrictions. What we are seeing now is, for example, he has already signaled support for two bills that have been proposed by female Republican lawmakers that would do the 15-week abortion ban. And he has said that that's reasonable and that makes a lot of sense. Right now, we are seeing a lot of appetite from Republican leaders as to doing something with abortion restrictions. And so we are seeing a lot of conversation, a lot of support from, it is a legislature that is dominated by Republicans, but to have Republican leaders also backing these proposals is a signal that there could be movement in that front. And that has some pro-life advocates pretty excited, and considering the makeup of the Florida Supreme Court, pairing it with the temperatures in the Florida Capitol, if you will, that is jointly being seen as a positive sign for them.
And thinking about sort of where things were even a year ago, does that represent a shift? And if so, what do we think are the factors that might be behind that shift? And I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on that.
I mean, I think a 15-week ban is about what I would have expected. It would have been more a surprise if Florida had, for example, followed Texas in introducing a ban at 6 weeks, because I think in Florida you have forces pulling in opposite directions, and you really have ever since the Supreme Court was changed, which is that you have an electorate which isn't particularly pro-life, and you have an administration and a legislature that's quite pro-life. And so how you kind of square that circle, right? How legislators, cater to the demands of pro-life groups that want to see restrictions on abortion, but do so without jeopardizing the re-election chances of lawmakers from sort of more moderate or swing districts. That was always going to be challenging. And I think there came a point when Governor DeSantis, I think Anna's right, was not only not reaching out to discuss abortion when it came to a 6-week ban, he was sort of assiduously avoiding it because it was sort of unclear how best for Republicans to tackle this issue. And 15-week bans, I think, are pretty much in keeping with what I would have expected, because it's a ban, right? So that's going to make pro-life groups in Florida happy, but it's not a ban that's going to affect many people in practical terms, because the vast majority of abortions in Florida, just as is the case nationwide, happen well before 15 weeks. And so in real world terms, if you're thinking either in terms of people from Florida getting abortions in Florida or people from out of state getting abortions in Florida, it's not necessarily going to drive that number down very much. So while it may upset people who are pro-choice in Florida, it's not likely to be a kind of major game changer when it comes to how they think about Governor DeSantis, for example. And it's not really likely to change the abortion rate in Florida, which is, one of the highest in the nation. So it felt very in keeping with what I've seen or what I would have expected when this was the bill that I saw getting traction with the governor and the legislature.
Right. It was definitely interesting because there were, before the 15-week abortion ban was proposed just this week at the start of the legislative session with the backing of Republican leaders, there were other bills filed by Republicans that would have been more similar to the one that Texas was proposing, the Hartford bill. And that didn't really quite gain a lot of traction. So now we're seeing the full support of, at least signs of full support from Republican leaders that this is going to be the vehicle if there is going to be any abortion restrictions. So it was interesting to see Florida lawmakers, or even Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who has in other issues that are of national interest following the suit of Texas, for example, with issues like immigration or critical race theory, seeing the abortion debate be a little bit different when it comes to the types of restrictions that they will be, pushing hard for. And like I mentioned before, it is an election year. Governor Ron DeSantis is seeking re-election, although he says that he's not one to look at polling and be influenced by that. It does raise questions as to how palatable or how much support there was with something with legislation like the one that was passed in Texas. And we did see, for example, in the summertime last year, DeSantis signed Florida onto a brief that was backing Mississippi. So there was signs that they were more aligned with Mississippi more so than Texas.
One thing I've been really curious about with regard to Florida, is I guess there's two parts to this. One is you mentioned, right, that the public opinion looks different around this issue. The voters could be different here from, say, other states that often get grouped with Florida. And it also seems to me, right, that there are differences and tensions between city governments that might be bluer and state governments. And I'm curious, how do those dynamics change not only the politics around abortion, but what access might look like in different parts of the state?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's really hard is that access to abortion in Florida has been pretty good, but some of that is because of the state Supreme Court decision, which has been on the books since 1989. And the Florida legislature attempted to get around it in recent years by passing a parental involvement restriction, but pro-choice groups didn't really take the bait. So there still hasn't been a state Supreme Court decision reversing that 1989 ruling that Anna mentioned. So now, we're in a world where access is pretty good, but it's not clear if that's just because cities have more abortion supportive policies, although that's definitely part of it. As you can imagine, access to abortion in Florida tracks pretty much political affiliation, with much better access in urban, bluer areas than elsewhere. But the politics, I think, have always been a little bit ambiguous because of that state Supreme Court decision. And it's consequential, not just in Florida, but nationwide, because Florida sort of has been a place that people regionally travel for abortions. And as one of the more populous states, it's been one of the states that contributes the most to the national abortion rate, both in terms of rate and in terms of raw numbers. And so going forward, the question, I think, for a lot of people is going to be whether Florida is going to eventually become like its neighbors, right? Like Alabama or Georgia, where, the 15-week ban is just a step on the road to a ban at fertilization, or whether instead Governor DeSantis and the legislature are looking to make Florida sort of a middle ground, right? Where abortion is restricted but not banned, or abortion is banned late in pregnancy but not early in pregnancy, or something like that. If there's going to be a sort of third way for states, other than, abortion is accessible and funded, or abortion is entirely illegal, and if Florida is going to embody that kind of third way or not, I don't think we know the answer to that yet.
Right, and I do think that is something, depending on where this legislation goes this year and what happens in Florida, I think that in neighboring states, it is going to be something to watch, for example, as to what the impact is for people from, say, Georgia or Alabama, who might have been traveling to a state like Florida to get an abortion up to the third trimester. And that is something that we're watching right now. For example, in Leon County, that is more of a Democratic stronghold in North Florida. That could potentially be a place where maybe some people from other states would have turned to, so that's something that we're going to be keeping an eye on as to what the influence is in the South if Florida were to turn and be more restrictive with abortion.
Mary, you initially described Florida as a bellwether, which I think is really interesting, right? And as we sort of imagine, right, the Supreme Court is looking at Roe v. Wade and its protections. A decision is expected sometime this summer, possibly. What paths do we see Florida taking? And maybe one way to ask this question as well is, what role does a state like Florida play, not only for Alabama and for Georgia, but for places like Mississippi, Louisiana, and even Texas, right? When it often is the place that people have had to go to.
Yeah, when I said Florida was a bellwether, like we have it. So, I'm here to tell you the Supreme Court's probably going to overrule Roe this summer. Like it's not, I don't think there's a whole lot of ambiguity about the Supreme Court is going to overrule Roe. And the only ambiguity is it going to be this summer or next summer or the summer after that? There's going to come a time when states ban abortion. And I think the question really is going to be whether we're so polarized that there's only going to be two camps of states, right? States that just criminalize all abortions, or states that pretty much permit abortions without limits, or whether there's going to be a third category of states that restrict abortion but don't ban it outright. And I think Florida is a kind of prime candidate or prime sort of laboratory to figure out whether that's going to be true, which means, of course, that's going to be a site of a lot of contestation, right? There's going to be a lot of money spent in Florida. There's going to be a lot of activism in Florida, and not just from the usual suspects, not just from folks that usually work in Florida, but from national organizations that are going to understand both that Florida is significant because it's going to probably be potentially the only place regionally where abortion will be available, right? So the only place that people across the South will be able to go either on, a short plane ride or a plausible drive, but also as a kind of a signal of where other sort of battleground states could be heading. And it's particularly significant because some other battleground states like Wisconsin already have pre-Roe abortion bans on the books. And so even if their politics would make their abortion policies hard to predict, there's already something baked in that's going to make it likely that those states are going to ban abortion. That isn't true as much in Florida. So I think what happens in places like Florida where there's real uncertainty may tell us whether we're going to see a kind of third wave for states on abortion, and what that looks like in terms of whether there's access or not.
Thinking about the policy implications as well, right? I know we talked a bit about how if a 15-week ban is passed, right, the vast majority of abortions do occur before 15 weeks. Who are the people, right, who would not be able to access an abortion if a law like this took effect?
Yeah, I mean, the people who have abortions later in pregnancy, it's a kind of a mixed bag. It's often people with wanted pregnancies who discover either that the pregnant person has some kind of health condition that makes it unsafe to continue the pregnancy, or people who discover that the fetus or child has a condition that's incompatible with life, or maybe some kind of disability. So those are often the most common reasons. Occasionally, if you're right at the 15-week mark, the other thing that can happen is that abortion is expensive. It's more expensive the further in pregnancy you go. And there are lots of rules in places like Florida and elsewhere that kind of can push you out more, right? So like waiting periods and other things. So there can be people who take, more than 15 weeks to get together the resources to have an abortion and to make the decision to have an abortion. So disproportionately, disproportionately in general, people who are having abortions tend to be people of color and tend to be low income. And the subset of folks who are moving later in pregnancy tend to be a mixture of people who have medical reasons for discontinuing wanted pregnancies and people who lack the resources to pay for abortion early in pregnancy when they might have wanted to.
Another layer to access here, for example, the proposals that are moving here in the legislature, they do, like we mentioned, they do the 15-week abortion ban, but there's really no exceptions for victims of rape or incest, for example. And the sponsors of the bill, at least one of them in the Senate, has said that it's because they think 15 weeks is enough time for even those victims to be able to have an abortion if they so wish. So there is going to be we can expect to see a lot of debate about access for these types of individuals who might have been, they're victims of a crime, and maybe it's not just because of the health of the mother or the fetus. It's more so about the situation, about them being victims of incest or rape, and so that's going to be a very high profile part of the debate. And how they juggle and thread the line of, who do they give protections to or not? That's going to be a pretty high profile part of it.
On a sheer level of politics and voter public opinion in Florida, why does abortion here look different from, say, politics around masks or vaccinations or other sorts of hyper-partisan health issues? And is that something that we see changing over the long term? Are there demographic shifts we should be aware of, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. I think if you look at, so Florida has a slightly lower percentage of white evangelical Protestants than, say, Georgia or Alabama, and that tends to be one of the kind of home bases of the pro-life movement. I think that Florida Republicans, and I'm generalizing, but there are a good number of fiscally conservative Florida Republicans who are retirees who may have a wide variety of views on social issues like abortion, and maybe Republican primarily either because there's some military Republicans in Florida who are conservative primarily on national defense issues, and there are some Florida Republicans who are Republicans, that moved to Florida, for example, because they didn't want to pay state income tax, right? Who may not particularly have a problem with legal abortion. Elsewhere in the South, for example, Alabama has a very, very large white evangelical Protestant population that views abortion as, a violation of human rights and a sin. So I think that's part of the difference, that Florida, first of all, is just less Republican than, for example, Alabama. A more interesting comparator would be like Georgia, which is also a swing state. And I think in that sense, Florida may have a slightly lower rate of religiosity than Georgia, and may have different kinds of Republicans, some of whom may be less invested in abortion politics than you would expect to see elsewhere in the South. And the other live question that Anna and I might both have is is it different anymore, right? Because a lot of the data points we have on, popular opinion in Florida, or Florida voters being not wanting to change policies, some of those data points are several years old, right? So it's also unclear about whether Florida is in fact getting redder or not. But if you think of prototypical, who are Florida Republicans, Cuban Americans might not be as conservative on abortion, for example, as white evangelical Protestants in Alabama, right? And you can kind of go down the line of different Republican constituencies who may be a little bit more diverse on their opinions on abortion than you might see elsewhere in the South.
Right. I mean, we have seen, for example, Governor Ron DeSantis, since he took office in the last, since 2019, when he took office, he has been taking a pretty right turn to how he does policy. And we see it with education, we see it with immigration, we see it with criminal justice, we see it with pretty much everything, including healthcare now with the pandemic happening. He was an anti-mandate governor, whether it was for vaccines, he was an anti-mandate for masks. He was, and so it is interesting to see how he's handling the debate with abortion, and why he opted to maybe signal support more so for something less, not as restrictive as what Texas did. And it does make you wonder, like we said, about whether he's looking at the demographics, whether he's looking at the national polls for this, who is he listening to, and why is it not moving more to the right as other states were doing? DeSantis has become, a national conservative darling. He's on Fox News a lot. He's, does not have supporters who are very conservative. He has, he's among the top people who are being talked at the national level for potentially running for president in 2024. So it's sometimes a lot of his decisions are based on a national audience. So it is interesting to see him walk this fine line with this specific policy and how conservatives might be viewing it. There's a lot of Democrats here in Florida, including his opponents for governor, who are saying, it's the governor is all about freedom, for example, when it came to the pandemic measures that he imposed. But when it comes to abortion, there's a different rhetoric, there's a different message that he's sending. So it's just interesting to see how he's going to be handling the messaging. And I do think that he's not a governor that shies away from the national conversation. So with conservatives, so looking at that specifically will be something to keep in mind as we think about demographics and who he's trying to appeal to.
Sort of going off that, Anna, do you think that the presidential chatter around Ron DeSantis could color what kinds of proposals we see him endorse, right, closer to when we actually are in a primary season?
Absolutely. I mean, it's Governor Ron DeSantis we're talking about. He's, he's on Fox News, I would like to say maybe 80% of the week, or if he's not on Fox News, he's on a podcast for I'm sorry, there's noise in the house. So there is a lot of national politics does influence the governor, and we do see that a lot here with the governor. And we do see, for example, the influence of other conservative influencers, if you will, influence sometimes what he will advocate for. We did see critical race theory again become a huge part of the discussion, and it was after it became a big talking point on national media outlets. So I do think abortion has the potential of influencing the conversation here, and based on what is happening at the national level, which is why I think we saw the governor sign Florida onto this brief in support of the Mississippi law that is now in the U.S. Supreme Court. So it's part of a national conversation that he wants to, even if it's not directly involving Florida, it is inserting him in the national conversation and his support for something that is of national interest.
Yeah, I think the balance for Ron DeSantis is he's sort of running in a shadow primary for the GOP nomination in the event that Donald Trump doesn't run, and he's also running for governor of Florida, and those two things don't line up when it comes to abortion, right? Because from a GOP primary standpoint, DeSantis doesn't want to open himself to attacks from the right that he's soft on abortion, right? That he's not going as far as some of his for example, as former President Trump or other potential putative, candidates for the GOP nomination like Ted Cruz. On the other hand, he doesn't want to alienate what still appears to be a majority of Florida voters that don't really want to see a ban on abortion from fertilization. So I think the 15-week ban is Governor DeSantis trying to thread that needle, right? Because it's not clear. He can say to the people on his right, I haven't said this is where I'm stopping. This could just be like the opening salvo, but it's also saying to Florida voters who are not ready to go past that, like, I'm not actually signing on to anything more sweeping than this. I'm just saying 15 weeks. And like, if you want to read into that, that's on you. I'm not saying anything more than that. So I think it's an effort to finesse an issue that's going to be difficult for him, given that he has political ambitions at the state and federal level.
Do either of you see room either this year or in the coming years for other kinds of restrictions beyond this gestational limit, right? I'm thinking about restrictions on medication abortion, for instance, or other limitations on when and how abortions can be administered.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to just be the same balancing act, right? Because I mean, there are Republicans from deep red parts of Florida that are going to push bans all the way to fertilization who are not going to be happy with the 15-week ban. And then there are going to be Republicans from districts that are kind of purple who are not going to want to go faster than this. And Florida, for the foreseeable future, seems to be likely to be a Republican-controlled state. So I think really what we're likely to see out of Florida is going to be whatever kind of negotiated settlement there's going to be between those two factions of Republicans. But I don't imagine that, the pro-life movement is not going to let up pressure on this issue, and neither are Republican legislators from the more conservative parts of Florida. So I think really the question is just, how much resistance are the more moderate Republicans going to put up because they're going to be afraid of losing their seats, or how much are they going to think that voters in Florida are more loyal enough to Republicans that they're not ultimately going to care as much about abortion policy, even if it doesn't suit them.
Right, I do think that it's there's been a Republican hold on the legislature and the governor's mansion for a few decades now here in Florida, so I don't foresee that changing too much in the near future. And I do think, for example, that the proposals, if they were to pass this year, there are provisions in those bills that would start like this information gathering process that would require providers to tell the state agency that ACA that would monitor this abortion process, to tell them so providers would need to tell ACA how many abortions are performed through medication. So the fact that there's going to be an information gathering process for abortion through medication, I don't know if that opens the door for more restrictions, but it does open the door for lawmakers to start pointing the finger at, look, these are the numbers, and we need to, maybe take a closer look at something that we might want to do if we are not in agreement with it. So there is more tools that would be available to politicians who might want more restrictions and have more data to back up potential arguments as they try to push further legislation in the future.
I know we're running low on time, so before we wrap up, I wanted to ask you, and this is a tough question, but if you were to hypothesize 10 years from now what abortion access and law looks like in Florida, I mean, long term, where do you think the state is headed?
Looking at the electorate, and I really, like I mentioned earlier, I really don't see Democrats taking control of the legislature or potentially the governor's office, but it's, you know, having those political dynamics in mind. I think that there is room for more restrictions 10 years from now. It's Florida, so you never really can predict fully, even though it is looking redder and redder, not as purple as it was before. But it's really tough to predict anything that can happen in Florida because it is such a toss-up state most of the time. You know, Governor Ron DeSantis won by 32,000 votes, so it's not it's not necessary. And then the demographics are ever changing. More people are moving in, more people are moving out, and so it's really difficult to predict what we're going to be looking like in 10 years. So it would be a difficult prediction.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are kind of two possible futures that one could see. I think one is a continuation of what we see now, where Florida is red, but less red on abortion than it is on other issues. And that Florida sort of stakes out that position as being neither an abortion prohibitor or an abortion permitter, but sort of an abortion restrictor. I think that's one possibility. That's probably going to be the possibility that best reflects popular opinion in Florida, even 10 years from now. As much as the state's demographics are changing, there's been a good amount of consistency in popular opinion on abortion in Florida, even as it's trended redder. I think there's an equal possibility that Florida will continue to ban more and more abortions, in part because, as Anna mentioned, Republicans have really consolidated power in Florida, and the more politically uncompetitive the state becomes, I think the more the legislature may cater to the base versus the sort of median Florida voter. Because if Florida voters are going to put Republicans in the legislature, regardless of what they do about abortion, then Republican legislators may feel more beholden to, you know, pro-life donors and pro-life groups that do more on a kind of day-to-day basis to keep them in office than they are worried about average voters who don't want to see abortion bans. So I think if I were guessing, I would guess that over time, Florida would restrict abortion more and more and more because of broader political trends in the state. But I'm not confident about that. And I think it's possible that Florida could wind up landing somewhere in the middle and restricting abortion, but never fully banning it.
Thank you both so much. This has been so elucidating. I've learned so much, and I really appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
That wraps up today's conversation on the state of reproductive rights. Thank you so much to our speakers and to everyone who joined us. And thank you again to our streaming partner, Mississippi Today. If you want to be among the first to hear about our upcoming events, you can sign up now at 19thnews.org/subscribe. A final thanks to the thousands of members who support our nonprofit newsroom. Your donations truly make conversations like today's possible. If you're not a 19th member yet, you can become one at 19thnews.org/membership. We look forward to welcoming you to the 19th family, and we'll see you at our next event.